On the morning of January 11th, 1944, a young man climbed into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt at an airfield in northwestern Germany. He was in his early 20s. He wore the gray-blue tunic of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot. He knew exactly what the day would bring, because he had lived through this same day, over and over, for the past year.
His individual identity is unknown today, but his experience reflected that of hundreds of Luftwaffe fighter pilots on that morning. There were hundreds like him that morning. This is his story and theirs. The American bombers would come.
They would come in enormous silver formations, 400 strong, throwing off cold contrails at 20,000 feet. Their little fighter escort would run beside them across the North Sea, across the Dutch coast, and then at the German border, the little fighters would run out of fuel and turn back.
And then he and his squadron would move in, and they would kill them. German fighters had successfully intercepted deep bomber raids for much of the previous 2 years. There was no reason to believe this morning would be any different. He was wrong about everything.
To understand why he was wrong, you have to go back 3 months, to a day the American air crews still called Black Thursday. October 14th, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany, a ball-bearing complex deep inside the Reich. 291 B-17 flying fortresses took off from bases in England that morning to destroy it.
60 of them never came home. Another 142 came home broken. Skin holed by cannon fire, engines dead, crews wounded, crews missing. In a single afternoon, the United States 8th Air Force had lost the equivalent of an entire combat wing.
At his headquarters northwest of London, Lieutenant General Ira Eaker read the loss reports and understood that his entire theory of war was breaking apart in front of him. For 2 years, the Americans had believed something the British had already stopped believing.
They believed a heavily armed bomber, flown in tight formation, could defend itself. That formations of B-17s, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, could punch through enemy fighter defenses in broad daylight, hit precision targets and return home. Schweinfurt proved they could not. The math was brutal.
At a 10% loss rate per mission, the statistical chance of a bomber crew surviving 25 missions was almost zero. The air crews knew this. They flew the missions anyway, but they knew Eaker had run out of answers. The bombers needed fighter escort, all the way to the target, all the way home.
But no American fighter had that kind of range. Early P-47 escort missions remained significantly shorter in range than the later Merlin-powered Mustang, before its fuel gauges began to bite. The P-38 Lightning had more range, but there were too few of them, and most were fighting in the Mediterranean and the Pacific.
Beyond the fighters' turnback point, the bombers flew naked. That was where the Luftwaffe hunted them. On January 6, 1944, 5 days before the pilot in the Messerschmitt would climb into his cockpit, a small aircraft touched down at an airfield in the English countryside. From it stepped a compact, sharp-eyed man. James Harold Doolittle.
Racing pilot, aeronautical engineer, doctor of science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and, on April 18, 1942, the man who had led 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. He was here to replace Eaker. The change of command was announced quietly.
Eaker was being sent to the Mediterranean. Doolittle was taking over the 8th Air Force. Officially, it was a reorganization. Unofficially, it was a message. The old theory had failed. Someone new was going to try something different. Doolittle had 5 days before the next major mission. He was going to need every one of them.
But what he was going to try was not going to be his invention. What he was going to try had already been built 4 years earlier and half a world away by a group of men who had almost thrown it in the trash. Spring 1940, Inglewood, California.
A group of Englishmen in grey suits walked into a hangar at North American Aviation and asked for something impossible. They were the British Purchasing Commission. The Battle of Britain was coming. The Royal Air Force needed every fighter it could get. They wanted North American to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. Hundreds of them. Now.
James Kindleberger, the president of North American, said no. Instead, he offered to design something better from scratch. In 120 days, the British had no choice. They agreed. 102 days later, an unpainted airframe rolled out of the North American factory. It had a razor-thin fuselage.
one of the earliest laminar flow wing designs to enter large-scale production, and a radiator scoop under the belly that engineers said would fail. It was called the NA-73X. On October 26, 1940, it flew. The British called it a Mustang. For the first 2 years of its life, almost nobody in America wanted it. The problem was the engine.
The Mustang carried an Allison V-1710, a 12-cylinder inline that made good power at low altitude and lost it catastrophically above 15,000 feet. The United States Army Air Forces looked at the aircraft, saw a beautiful airframe married to the wrong power plant, shrugged, ordered a small batch for ground attack and reconnaissance.
Gave it a lukewarm designation, moved on. By the winter of 1942, the Mustang was on its way to becoming a footnote. Then, on April 30th, 1942, a Royal Air Force test pilot climbed into the cockpit of a Mustang Mark I at RAF Duxford. His name was Ronald Harker. He was 32 years old. He tested fighters for Rolls-Royce.
What he wrote in his report after that single flight would change the outcome of the air war over Europe. The airframe, he said, was superb. The visibility was excellent. The handling was among the finest he had ever encountered. But the engine was strangling everything the airframe could do.
Give this aircraft the Merlin, Harker wrote, and you will have the finest fighter in the world. The Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, the same two-stage supercharged high-altitude power plant that had won the Battle of Britain. Within months, the marriage was performed.
A Packard-built Merlin, licensed by Rolls-Royce and manufactured in Detroit, was mated to a Mustang airframe. The first Merlin-powered Mustang prototype flew in October 1942, with production variants following soon afterward. The performance numbers came back and stopped conversations in rooms full of engineers.
Flight testing demonstrated a dramatic improvement in climb rate and high-altitude performance, 440 miles per hour at altitude, and range. Range that, with two 75-gallon drop tanks, gave the new P-51B a combat radius no single-engine American fighter had ever possessed.
It could reach the aircraft factories of central Germany and come home again. The deep targets that had killed the unescorted B-17s over Schweinfurt were, for the first time, within reach of a fighter that could stay with them all the way in and all the way back. The math had just changed.
Production of the new variant began at Inglewood in June 1943. By November, the first squadrons were forming up in England. They just needed a unit to fly them. The unit that got them was the 354th Fighter Group. It had been formed on November 15, 1942, at Hamilton Field, north of San Francisco Bay.
It had trained on Bell P-39 Airacobras across the American Southwest. In October and November of 1943, it had crossed the Atlantic on the troopship HMS Athlone Castle and arrived at Greenham Common in England, expecting to be told what it would fly. At the docks in Liverpool, the men had noticed something.
The cargo being unloaded alongside their own equipment was a shipment of brand new fighters. They were P-51B Mustangs. The 354th moved to a base called Boxted in the flat farmland of Essex on November 13, 1943. Its commander was a lieutenant colonel named Kenneth Ray Martin, 33 years old, career fighter pilot.
A man who taught his squadrons a single principle above all others. In a head-on attack against an enemy fighter, you do not break away. Ever. His squadrons learned it. Some of them would use it in ways he did not intend. But there was something the 354th did not know.
Something that, in the confusion of a rapidly expanding air war, almost nobody was talking about. They did not belong to the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force was strategic. It flew the heavy bombers, the four-engined Leviathans that struck deep into Germany.
The 8th needed long-range escort fighters more than any other unit in the American military. The 354th Fighter Group belonged to the 9th Air Force. The 9th was tactical. Its mission was ground support, close air support for the invasion of Europe that everyone knew was coming. It flew fighter bombers and medium bombers.
It was not, by any doctrine of the American Air Arm, supposed to be escorting B-17s to central Germany. But the 9th had the Mustangs, and the 8th did not. So an agreement was quietly reached. The 354th would remain under 9th Air Force on paper. But in the air, for the missions that mattered, it would answer to 8th Fighter Command.
The 354th Fighter Group became the first USAAF unit to employ Merlin-powered P-51Bs as long-range bomber escorts over Europe was, in a sense, the wrong unit, from the wrong Air Force. On loan for a mission it had never been designed for. At Boxted, 40 miles east of London, a 30-year-old squadron commander was preparing for that mission.
Major James Howell Howard. He had been born on April 8, 1913, in Canton, on the southern coast of China, where his American father taught eye surgery at a Christian medical college. He spoke Mandarin as a child. He had come to America for high school. He had joined the United States Navy. He had earned his wings at Pensacola.
And in 1941, he had resigned his Navy commission to fly a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk for a secret unit called the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers. He had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in the sky above the country of his birth. Now he was 30 years old, the commanding officer of the 356th Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group.
In 5 days he would fly a mission he did not yet know the details of. It would take him to a factory town he had never heard of, in a country he had never seen from the air. The target was called Oschersleben. The intelligence officers would explain it in the briefing rooms on the morning of the mission.
The Agio Flugzeugwerk at Oschersleben was one of the principal remaining subcontractors producing Focke-Wulf 1N Krugerite Reich. It had become critical after the Focke-Wulf plant at Marienburg had been destroyed by American bombers on October 9, 1943. The Junkers factory at Halberstadt was making wing assemblies for Ju-88 bombers.
The Wagram works near Braunschweig were building Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters. The twin-engine killers that carried rockets under their wings and fired them into the American bomber formations from beyond the range of the 50-caliber guns.
The Americans were being sent to bomb the factories that built the fighters that would rise to kill them. Every Focke-Wulf that came up to defend Oschersleben was a Focke-Wulf that had rolled off the assembly line the men above were now trying to destroy. Every Bf-110 that carried rockets toward the bomber stream had been built at Wagram.
Every Ju-88 they might face on some future mission was that day half-assembled in the Junkers works at Halberstadt. The war had reached a point where one side was bombing the tools the other side needed to fight the bombing. The men in the briefing rooms understood the equation immediately.
And there was something else they did not fully understand yet. The aircraft that was about to make the whole mission possible, the fighter that would keep them alive over central Germany for the first time in the war, was, in the arithmetic of the American Air Arm, not officially theirs.
The most important fighter in the 8th Air Force belonged to the 9th Air Force.
Which meant that the moment history was about to turn on, the moment when American fighters would finally reach the heart of the Reich and stay there, was going to be delivered by an aircraft the 8th had borrowed, from a unit that had never been designed for the job. It was Monday, January 10th, 1944.
In 24 hours, the alarm clocks in the Nissen huts across East Anglia were going to start ringing in the dark, and the young pilot in the gray-blue tunic, at his airfield in northwestern Germany, was going to strap himself into a Messerschmitt for what he believed would be an ordinary day. He was wrong. The alarm clocks went off in the dark.
Across the flat farmland of East Anglia, in Nissen huts scattered around more than 40 airfields, young men opened their eyes to the same corrugated iron ceiling they had opened them to the day before. A single bare bulb. The smell of damp wool and coal smoke and shaving cream. It was 4 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, January 11th, 1944.
At Dienethorpe, in Northamptonshire, the pilots and navigators and bombardiers of the 401st Bombardment Group filed into the officers' mess with tin cups of coffee and sat down on wooden benches. A curtain hung across a map at the front of the room. Everyone knew what that curtain meant.
When it came down, some of the men in that room would find out they were going to die that day. The curtain came down. The red yarn on the map ran east from England, across the North Sea, across the Dutch coast, deep into central Germany, deeper than most of them had ever flown. The yarn ended at 3 towns nobody in the room had ever heard of.
Oschersleben, Halberstadt, Braunschweig, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. At the front of the room, the intelligence officer explained what the mission was, and what waited for them at the other end of it. Aircraft factories, fighter production.
the German war machine's ability to make the aircraft that would rise up to kill them.
The men listened. Then the intelligence officer told them who was going with them. Escort would be provided in 3 stages. P-47 Thunderbolts would cover them across the North Sea and as far into Germany as their fuel could carry them. That was the deepest any American fighter had ever gone.
Beyond that point, for the first time in the history of the war, they would still have friends in the sky. 49 P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group would meet them over the target, 49. There were more than 600 bombers in the mission.
There were, based on radar reports, at least 400 German fighters waiting for them, approximately 49 P-51Bs, but it was more than they had ever had before. 40 miles to the east, at Boxted, the pilots of the 354th Fighter Group were getting the same briefing at the same hour. Their target was not a factory.
Their target was to keep the bombers alive. Major James Howard sat in the second row and listened. Beside him and around him sat pilots he had trained and flown with for a year. Young men, most of them, 22, 23, 25. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Martin, Group Commander, 33 years old.
A man who had built this squadron from empty hangars in the American Southwest and led it across the Atlantic and into combat. He finished the briefing with a single sentence. Any questions? There were none. Takeoff began at 7:30 in the morning. If you have ever stood on a runway in the English winter, you know the feeling.
The mist rolls low across the grass. The taxiways glisten with frost. The engines of a 4-engined bomber, spinning up in the cold, sound something ancient and enormous being wakened against its will. Now imagine 663 of them. They rose from more than 40 airfields across East Anglia, B-17 flying fortresses.
B-24 Liberators, silver and olive drab, forming up in the pale winter sky, wingtip to wingtip, climbing to 20,000 feet in slow, patient spirals. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the formation was crossing the Dutch coast. That was when the weather began to fail. The forecast had promised broken cloud over Germany.
The reality was solid overcast, climbing higher than the bombers could fly, streaming in from the northwest in unbroken layers. The lead navigators radioed back to command. The escort fighters were losing sight of their charges. The bomb groups were losing sight of each other. A 400-plane formation in a thunderstorm is not a bomber stream.
It is a slaughter waiting to happen. At the operations building of 8th Bomber Command at High Wycombe, on the outskirts of London, a decision was made. Recall. The order went out over the wireless. The 2nd Bombardment Division, headed for Braunschweig, turned around and began the long flight home.
The 3rd Bombardment Division, headed for Halberstadt and secondary targets, did the same. The 1st Bombardment Division did not. And here is the first bitter irony of the day. The recall order had been issued to save the bombers, to keep them out of a weather trap, to pull them back before the Luftwaffe could concentrate on them.
But by splitting the mission into 2 halves, the recall did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. The Luftwaffe controllers on the ground, watching their radar screens in northern Germany, saw the American formation change. They saw the larger part of it turn west and go home.
And they saw the smaller part, the 1st Bombardment Division, keep coming. 238 bombers, instead of 600, which meant the Luftwaffe, which had been preparing to defend against a maximum effort raid, could now concentrate its maximum effort against 1/3 of one.
The mechanism designed to protect the Americans had just made them the target. At the head of the 1st Bombardment Division flew a B-17 carrying a 39-year-old brigadier general named Robert Falligant Travis. Travis was tall, hard-jawed, a Georgian, a West Point graduate, one of the youngest general officers in the American Air Arm.
He had commanded combat units in North Africa. He was known as a man who led from the front. Today, he was leading from the front of the deepest penetration mission the 8th Air Force had ever attempted. The recall order reached his radio operator. Travis read it.
He looked out through the cockpit windows at the 238 bombers strung out behind him in the winter sky. He calculated the distance to the target. He calculated the distance back to England. He weighed the risk of turning a massive formations around inside German airspace, breaking up the defensive box,
exposing every bomber to the Luftwaffe individually. Then he made his decision. He would press on. Historians have argued about that decision for 80 years. Some have called it courageous. Others have called it reckless. Some have called it both. Here is what is certain.
When Robert Travis chose to continue toward Oschersleben on the morning of January 11, 1944, 238 American heavy bombers stayed with him, and many of them would not return. His decision was, at the same moment, a catastrophe and a turning point.
A catastrophe because 60 crews, roughly 600 young men, were about to die or be captured because of it. A turning point because 49 P-51 Mustangs were about to reach central Germany for the first time in the war. And whether Travis knew it or not, that was going to change everything that came after.
You cannot have one without the other. That is what makes this story hard to tell. Below them, on the frozen airfields of northern Germany, the Luftwaffe was climbing to meet them. From bases at Dielen in the occupied Netherlands, from Rhein, from Giever on the North Sea coast, from Wunstorf, Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11.
The single-engine fighter wings responsible for the defense of the Reich, Messerschmitt Bf 109G, Focke-Wulf 190A, and with them the heavy fighters of Zersturgeschwader 26, twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110s, ungainly, slow, but carrying under each wing something the American bomber crews had learned to fear, the Werfer Granate 21.
A 21-centimeter rocket, fired from a tube slung under the wing from beyond the range of the bomber's 50 caliber machine guns. A direct hit from a WFR. GR-21 rocket could destroy or cripple a B-17 formation. The German plan had not changed in months. Wait for the escort fighters to turn back. Fire the rockets from long range.
Watch the American formation disintegrate. Send the single-engine fighters in through the wreckage to finish the survivors. It had worked at Regensburg. It had worked at Schweinfurt. It had worked again and again through the terrible autumn of 1943. There was no reason to believe it would not work today.
At exactly the moment the German fighters expected, the P-47 Thunderbolts began to turn for home. They had reached the limit of their fuel. They banked one by one and dove away toward the west, leaving the bomber formation naked. The Bf-110s of Zersturgeschwader 26 leveled off 10,000 feet above the bombers, opened their rocket tubes,
prepared to fire. That was when the escort arrived. 49 Mustangs, dropping down through the overcast, cutting straight through the German attack formation before the German pilots even understood what they were looking at. Few Luftwaffe pilots had previously encountered Merlin-powered Mustangs operating so deep over Germany.
They had been told to expect the usual American escorts, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, aircraft they knew, aircraft that would run out of fuel and turn away. The aircraft that came through the cloud that morning were different, longer, sleeker, a slender laminar flow wing, a radiator scoop under the belly.
A profile they had never seen before at that depth of penetration. A pilot of Jagdgeschwader 11, later interviewed after the war, would describe the moment his squadron made its intercept run. His flight closed on a group of bombers, confident that the fighters overhead were the shorter-range Thunderbolts.
When the first American fighter turned inside his wingman and stayed with him through a full split, at high altitude, he understood in a single second that everything the Luftwaffe had believed about the range of American fighters was wrong. He was one of the ones who lived to say it. Many were not.
Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Martin led the 354th Fighter Group into the fight. He would fight through the day, land his Mustang back at Boxted that evening, and continue as group commander for another month. His own story ended in a different sky, on a different mission, on the 11th of February, 30 days later.
But that is a story for the end of this one. On the 11th of January, over central Germany, the battle spread across 100 miles of sky. Individual Mustangs, separated from their leaders in the confusion, hunted individual German fighters. Some dove after Bf-109s trying to escape at low altitude,
and discovered, for the first time in the war, that an American fighter could catch them. Others climbed after Focke-Wulfs, and outturned them in the thin air above 30,000 feet. For the German pilots, something was happening that had never happened before. They tried to disengage. They rolled.
They broke away in the sharp, sudden climbs that had let them escape from P-47s and P-38s for 2 years. The Mustangs came with them. In the middle of all of this, one Mustang lost its group. Major James Howard had made his first pass on a Bf-1N that was climbing toward the bombers.
He closed to 200 yards, fired a short burst, and watched the German aircraft roll onto its back and fall away trailing black smoke. His first victory of the day. Then he pulled up hard, looking for his wingman. They were gone. In the swirling chaos of the dogfight, Howard had climbed above his squadron.
Below him, he could see contrails, tracer fire, aircraft turning in tight circles. But he could no longer identify friend from enemy. The radio was a wall of overlapping voices. His fuel gauge was already reading below half. He looked down.
20,000 feet below him, in a long gleaming line, the B-17s of the 1st Bombardment Division were still driving east toward Oschersleben. He looked closer. Coming in from the north, in loose finger fours, were German fighters, not 2 or 3, not 5 or 6. He counted and stopped counting. 30 or more.
There were no other American fighters in the sky. He pushed his stick forward and dove. The bomb group he came down on was the 401st. Its pilots were leading the target run for the day. A tail gunner in one of the ships saw the Mustang appear out of the sun and screamed a warning over the intercom. Then the gunner realized what he was looking at.
A single P-51, dropping down into a cloud of German fighters, not turning away, not calling for help. Attacking. Howard picked out a Focke-Wulf 190 that was setting up a run on the lead bomber. He closed to firing range. He squeezed the trigger. 2 of his 40 machine guns fired. The other 2 did not.
He did not know it yet, but he had just encountered the great flaw of the early P-51B Mustang. The 450 caliber guns were mounted at an angle inside the thin laminar flow wing, canted to fit the airfoil. Under the stress of a high-G maneuver, the ammunition belts twisted in their feed chutes. The guns jammed.
The wonder weapon was not perfect. Nothing is. 2 of Howard's 4 guns were already out of the fight. He kept firing anyway. The Focke-Wulf broke off. Howard turned inside another one and fired again. This time 3 guns worked. He hit the German fighter in the engine. Smoke poured out. The pilot bailed. 2 victories.
Howard pulled up and looked around. The bombers were still under attack. New German fighters were coming in from every direction. He made another pass, and another one after that. And somewhere in the next few minutes, over a factory town called Oschersleben, 3 of Howard's 4 guns failed completely. He was left with 1.
For the next 30 minutes, Major James Howard did the only thing he could think of. He kept flying at them. He would climb. He would pick a target. He would dive on it. He would fire whatever weapon still worked, and he would pull off. When he had 1 gun, he made the pass with 1 gun. When he had no gun, he still made the pass.
The German pilots saw an American fighter coming at them, and they broke away. They did not know his guns were empty. They only knew that if they did not evade, they might die.
For 30 minutes on the morning of January 11th, 1944, 1 American fighter pilot kept a swarm of Luftwaffe fighters off a formation of American bombers by making attack after attack after attack. Some of the passes had bullets in them, some did not. None of the German pilots knew which.
Inside the B-17s of the 401st Bombardment Group, gunners and bombardiers and navigators watched through their scarred plexiglass. They saw the single Mustang, alone against everything, turning tightly through the German formation. They saw it climb, dive, fire, and climb again. They did not know his name. They could not reach him on the radio.
They could see, painted on the side of his aircraft, 2 words in yellow. Ding Hao. It was a phrase Howard had picked up in China. It meant, roughly, very good. It was written in the language of the country where he had been born. Below them, the target was coming into view. The Ego Flugzeugwerk sprawled beside the railway line at Oschersleben.
The factory that was building the very fighters attacking them. The bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites. The bomb bay doors ground open. The bombs fell. The formation turned for home. Howard turned with them. His fuel gauge was reading close to empty. His guns were almost entirely jammed. His aircraft had been hit. He flew alongside the bombers on the north flank of the formation all the way to the Dutch coast. By the time the last Bf-109 broke off pursuit, James Howard had been in continuous combat for nearly 40 minutes. He had made, by the count of the bomber crews who watched him, at least 6 attack runs.
He had fired the last of his ammunition somewhere over the German border. 60 American heavy bombers did not come home from the raid of January 11, 1944,
the 401st Bombardment Group lost 4. Without the man in the Mustang, they would have lost many more.
At Boxted, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a P-51B with a blackened cowling and 3 cannon holes through its port wing came in low over the Essex countryside and set itself down on the runway. The ground crew climbed onto the wing. The man inside looked tired. Nothing more.
He unbuckled his harness, climbed out, and walked toward the debriefing hut. The intelligence officer asked him what had happened. Howard thought about it. He said he had gotten separated from his group. He said he had found a bomber formation under attack, and had done what he could. He said he thought he had shot down 2 German fighters.
Possibly 3. He was not sure. He asked whether the bombers had made it home. The intelligence officer did not know yet. Howard nodded, signed the report, and went to find something to eat. 40 miles to the north, at Deenathorpe, the surviving B-17s of the 401st Bombardment Group were coming home one by one.
The runway lights were on. Before the last of them landed, ambulances waited at the hard stands. Ground crews stood in the cold, counting aircraft as they came in, subtracting each returning bomber from the number that had left in the morning. When the arithmetic was finished, 4 B-17s were missing. It should have been many more.
Inside the debriefing rooms, the pilots and gunners were telling the intelligence officers the same story. There had been a Mustang. One Mustang. It had appeared out of the clouds when the German fighters came in. It had stayed with them all the way through the target run. It had fought off attack after attack, alone for more than half an hour.
Nobody knew whose it was. Nobody had seen the pilot's face. But every man in that room remembered 2 things: a yellow marking on the side of the aircraft, and 2 Chinese words painted below the cockpit. Somewhere in the American gunners' reports that evening, another number was written down.
The gunners of the 1st Bombardment Division claimed 174 German fighters shot down at Oschersleben. The mighty 8th War Diary would record it. It was almost certainly more than the total number of German fighters that had come up to intercept them.
Men in a burning bomber, looking out through a plexiglass turret at an enemy fighter smoking somewhere in the middle distance, will tell you what they saw. And what they saw was not always what happened. Fear does things to arithmetic, but that was the number that went into the report. At Deenathorpe, the group commander picked up the telephone.
His name was Colonel Harold Bowman, 40 years old, career officer. He had lost 4 crews that afternoon, 40 men. Now his pilots were telling him that most of the men who had come home had been kept alive by a single fighter pilot whose name nobody knew. Bowman began calling every fighter group within escort range of Oschersleben.
He asked the same question at each base. Do you have a pilot who was over Oschersleben this morning, alone in a Mustang with Chinese writing on it? At Boxted, they knew. They gave him the name. The name traveled faster than the man.
By the following Monday morning, a young reporter for the New York Times named Frederick Graham arrived at Boxted with a photograph and a notebook. He had heard, filtered through the sensors, the outline of what had happened on the 11th. He had come to see the pilot who had done it. Howard did not want to be seen.
He agreed to the interview because his commanding officer told him to. He sat on the edge of a folding chair in a Nissen hut. He answered questions in short, even sentences. Graham asked him how many German aircraft he had shot down. Howard said he was not sure. Graham asked him what he had been thinking, as he attacked 30 enemy fighters alone.
Howard said he had seen a job that needed doing. Graham asked whether he had been afraid. Howard said he had been busy. The story ran in the New York Times on January 19, 1944. The headline read, "One-man Air Force belittles his feat." The next morning, James Owens Howard was famous. Newspapers across America ran his photograph.
Radio broadcasts described the fight in language that was almost certainly too dramatic. Andy Rooney, then a young reporter for Stars and Stripes, called it the greatest fighter-pilot story of the war. Letters began to arrive at Boxted from the parents of B-17 crewmen, thanking him for their sons' lives. Howard read a few of them.
He did not know how to answer them. He wrote back to some anyway. But something else was happening while the newspapers were running his picture. Something bigger than one pilot. Something that would end the war in the air over Germany. It began at Boxted itself, 30 days after Oschersleben.
On the morning of February 11th, 1944,
Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Martin, the man who had built the 354th Fighter Group and led it into combat, took off on another escort mission. Over Germany, the group ran into a formation of enemy fighters. Martin closed on one of them, head-on, exactly the way he had taught his squadrons to close.
The two aircraft collided in mid-air. Martin survived. He bailed out at high altitude, drifted down through the cold German sky, and was captured on the ground with several broken bones. He would spend the next 15 months as a prisoner of war.
The next day, February 12, 1944, James Howard was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the 354th Fighter Group. The man in the yellow-painted Mustang was now running the entire outfit, but that was still one unit. What was about to change was the doctrine that governed all of them.
At the end of January, Major General James Doolittle had walked into his headquarters at High Wycombe and given an order that broke 60 years of military thinking. American fighters would no longer be tied to the bombers. They would no longer fly close escort. They would no longer wait for the enemy to come to them.
They would be released ahead of the bomber stream to hunt. The bomber crews complained. They wanted their little friends close, where they could see them. Doolittle did not care. He had studied the mathematics of Schweinfurt. He had studied what had happened at Oschersleben.
He understood that as long as the American fighters were flying defense, the Luftwaffe would choose when and where to fight. And as long as the Luftwaffe could choose, the Luftwaffe could survive. He was going to take that choice away. Between February 20th and February 25th, 1944, the 8th Air Force flew what history remembers as Big Week.
6 days of sustained assault on the German aircraft industry. Every heavy bomber in England, every fighter that could fly, weather that was, for once, on the American side. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the Reich as it had to. The Mustangs were waiting. During those 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 100 experienced day fighter pilots.
Veteran squadron leaders, flight commanders, the men who had taught the newer pilots how to fly interceptions against American bombers. 100 men, in 6 days. Those were pilots the German training system could not replace. On March 4, 1944, the first American fighters reached the sky over Berlin.
On March 6th, the first major American raid on the capital of the Third Reich went in. 69 bombers did not come home. 80 German fighters were shot down. The Luftwaffe kept fighting. It kept dying. By the summer of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups of the 8th Air Force were flying Mustangs.
The one exception was the 56th Fighter Group, which held on to its P-47 Thunderbolts out of pride, and by the end of the war had the highest kill total of any American fighter group in Europe. But they were the exception. The rule, after January 11, 1944, was the Mustang, and the rule was killing the Luftwaffe.
Here is the paradox that ended the German air arm. The German aircraft industry was not destroyed by the bombing. Dispersed into forests, into rail tunnels, into small workshops hidden across the Reich, it actually reached its highest monthly production figures in September 1944.
In that single month, German factories built more than 3,300 fighters. They had never built more. But there were no pilots to fly them. A new German fighter pilot arriving at his squadron in 1943 had received between 250 and 300 hours of flight training.
By the end of 1944, that number had fallen below 100 hours. An American replacement pilot in 1944 arrived at his group with more than 400 hours in his logbook. That was the equation. The Luftwaffe was not running out of aircraft. It was running out of the men who could fly them.
And the men who could fly them had been killed in the sky over their own country by escort fighters that did not turn back. Adolf Galland, the general of the German fighter arm, understood it better than anyone. He wrote about it after the war in the flat, honest sentences of a man who had lost.
The appearance of long-range American escort fighters, Galland wrote, was the decisive factor in the defeat of the Luftwaffe. Not the bombing, not the industry, the escort. The Reichsverteidigung had been built on a piece of arithmetic. The arithmetic said that single-engined American fighters could not reach central Germany from bases in England.
And as long as that arithmetic held, the German fighter arm had time. Time to intercept, time to withdraw, time to land and refuel and rise again for the next wave. On January 11th, 1944, the arithmetic changed.
Everything after that was just the counting. James Howard did not stay in combat much longer.
On January 30th, less than 3 weeks after Oschersleben, he shot down another Bf-110 over Brunswick. On April 8th, he shot down a Focke-Wulf 190 over the same city. It was his 6th aerial victory of the European War. His 12th of the entire conflict, counting the 6 he had scored in China with the Flying Tigers.
On June 5, 1944, on the eve of the invasion of Europe, General Karl Spaatz pinned the Medal of Honor onto the tunic of James Howell Howard on a windswept airfield in England. Howard was the only fighter pilot in the entire European theater of operations to receive the medal. The citation did not come from his own report.
He had barely written one. It came from the crews of the 401st Bombardment Group. Bomber pilots, bombardiers, radio operators, waist gunners. Men who had watched from their windows and turrets as a single American fighter kept them alive. Their words were what General Spaatz read that morning. Their gratitude was what the medal was made of.
Kenneth Martin was liberated from a prisoner of war camp in the spring of 1945. He came home, resumed his career in the new United States Air Force, and retired in 1950. He rarely spoke about the war.
Brigadier General Robert Travis, the man who had chosen to press on into Germany after the recall order, went on to command bomber wings in the Pacific. He was promoted to Major General after the war. On August 5, 1950, he was killed in the crash of a B-29 Superfortress at an airbase in California. The base was renamed in his honor.
To this day, it is called Travis Air Force Base. Adolf Galland survived the war. He wrote his memoirs. He became one of the most respected voices in post-war aviation history. He died in Remagen, Germany in 1996.
The men Howard fought that morning, the pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11 and Zerstörer 26, mostly did not survive. The ones who did rarely spoke of it. The ones who wrote memoirs, as some of them did, described the arrival of the long-range American fighter in nearly identical terms.
They had understood on that day that the war was going to be lost. Not that day, not that week, not that month, but eventually. And that from that morning forward there was no longer any patch of German sky where a Luftwaffe pilot could rest. James Howard came home to the United States. He married. He had children. He went into business in St.
Louis and then in Florida. He served as the director of a small airport near St. Petersburg. In 1991 he published a memoir. He called it Roar of the Tiger. It is a quiet book written by a man who never quite understood why so many people wanted to know his story. He died in Bay Pines, Florida, on March 18, 1995. He was 81 years old.
His Mustang did not survive the war. The P-51B with serial number 43-6T3 Fun 5, the aircraft the world knew as Ding Hao, was flown by other pilots of the 354th Fighter Group after Howard rotated home. The exact circumstances of its loss were never recorded. Not one of Howard's original combat aircraft is known to exist today. The story survived.
The airplane did not. 80 years have passed since the morning of January 11, 1944. The airfield at Boxted has become farmland. The airfield at Dienethorpe has become farmland. The town of Oschersleben, once the center of Focke-Wulf subcontract production for the Third Reich, is now a quiet market town in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt.
Old men who were boys when the bombers came still remember the day the sky filled with contrails and the smoke rose from the factory beside the railway.
Somewhere in the archives of the United States Air Force is a report written in the flat, careful language of a debriefing officer describing the actions of Major James Howell Howard on the morning of January 11, 1944. The document runs a few pages. It does not use the word hero. Howard would not have permitted it.
But the young man in the gray-blue tunic who climbed into a Messerschmitt that morning in northwestern Germany, believing he understood exactly what the day would bring, was walking toward a moment his side had not planned. For he was walking toward death of a piece of arithmetic.
The arithmetic had said that no American fighter could reach the center of Germany. The arithmetic had been the foundation of the entire German defense of the Reich, and on that morning, in the sky above a factory town, none of them had ever heard of, the arithmetic died. The Luftwaffe would keep fighting for 16 more months.
The pilots would keep climbing. The interceptors would keep coming up through the cold air of central Germany to meet the American bomber streams.
But the young pilot in the gray-blue tunic, and the hundreds like him he stood in for, had understood something by nightfall on January 11, 1944.
They had understood that from that day forward, wherever the bombers went, the fighters would go with them, all the way in, all the way home, and that in the equation of the air war, which had been in the Luftwaffe's favor since the summer of 1943, the sign had just flipped. The hunters had become the hunted.
The American bombers, for the first time in the long, terrible history of the daylight air war, had a friend who could go all the way with them. The man in the yellow-painted Mustang was the first proof. He would not be the last.